Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to History for Shut-ins, episode number 7. Today we will discuss the American Revolution, covering the battles of Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, New York City, and Trenton. As we had discussed in previous episodes of History for Shut-ins, the British were looking for ways to generate income, generate monies based on the debts that were incurred fighting the 7 Years' War against France and Spain about a decade earlier, actually 2 decades before the American Revolution. The 7 Years' War ends in 1763, and for more than a decade moving forward, there's increasing anger between the British and the colonists because there's a large influential segment of the U.S. colonies that is trying to say, hey, we are being taxed without being represented. But even bigger is there was concern that the British were going to infringe upon American rights, upon colonist rights, pardon me. So it's until early, once the revolution starts, it's not until early in 1778 that the conflict is a civil war in the British Empire between, of course, the British and the colonists. But afterwards, it becomes more of an international or world war as France joins in 1778 and then Spain joins in 1779 on the side of the colonists. And again, as we've said previously, they're not joining because they see the colonists set up a democratic republic. What they want to do is for the British to suffer. So that's why they come in on the side of the colonists. The Netherlands, at the same time, had provided both official recognition for the colonists, and they're also giving them sorely needed loans so that the colonists are able to buy ammunition and guns and food and all these other things. But the Netherlands as well is also engaged in its own war with the British during this time. Naval power is a determining factor during the course of the war. And when the war starts, Great Britain has the greatest army in the world, and they have the greatest navy in the world at the time. However, those things will change over the next 7 or 8 years. Because of the strength of their navy, which they relied on heavily, the British were able to use a very flexible troop strategy. In many of the battles that we're going to talk about, we're not talking about numbers from the Civil War, of course, here in America in the 1860s with hundreds of thousands of troops fighting. It's really just tens of thousands, but still, it's a sizable number. The troop flexibility allows the British to make up, or I shouldn't say make up, but to move quickly if needed. But on the same side of the coin, it also allows the colonists to move quickly who know the territory better, who know the colonies better, of course. The U.S. and the colonies, I should say, because we're not the United States yet at the time, but the colonies fought with 2 types of forces. They have the Continental Army, which is small, and they have state militias, which of course bring quite a bit to the table. Congress at the time, and really the colonies at the time, are very nervous about a standing army because they're afraid that they're going to be overthrown. Also, other than the French and Indian War, many of our forces do not have the experience of the British and the French and the Spanish and so on. The total number of the army provided by quotas from the states throughout the conflict was actually about 232,000 men. Now, a couple of minutes ago, I said we aren't talking hundreds of thousands of troops. Troops that are actually engaged, it's much smaller numbers. If the colonists had brought 232,000 troops to Bunker Hill. That would have been the end of the Revolution. However, militias bring a pretty sizable number as well. State militias bring about 164,000 troops. And we're talking about throughout the course of the Revolution, not all in 1775, right after Lexington and Concord. At any given time, U.S. forces or colonial forces rarely numbered more than 20,000. You're thinking, hey, wait, you just quoted numbers of almost 400,000, but less than 20,000 are fighting at any one time. And that's just how it worked out. In 1781, which is when the Battle of Yorktown takes place, there were only about 29,000 troops under arms throughout the entire colonies. The war was fought by small field armies, and this is why Washington and his generals were able to extend the war and pick their spots to fight. There aren't a lot of major land battles in the war. It's really a lot of hit and run type of battles, which we're going to talk about. Militias, which were poorly disciplined, and their officers were elected by the militia. So if my good friend Andy Phillips from Michigan is in the militia with me, and Andy has a huge following in the militia, they might make him a colonel or a general, even though he's got no military experience. Very similar things happened during the Civil War, is that positions of importance in the Army were handed out to friends based on really nepotism or friendship as opposed to military skill. So you've got these sorts of things going on. The militias, by the way, were rarely summoned for more than a 3-month period. So you've always got this thought in the back of Washington's head that if I'm going to fight, I've got to do it now because I'm going to be losing troops throughout the war. The terms of the Continental Army were only anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Initially, it started at 1 year, and then it was extended. And of course, when the war first started, both sides thought it would be one battle, it would be over, and that's it, much like most wars, quite frankly. Bounties are offered to colonial soldiers, as well as the promise of land. What does the U.S. or what do the colonies have at the time? They don't have a lot of money, but they have incredible amounts of land. Now, of course, the Native American tribes would fight us on that, saying that it's their land, but there was a surplus of land to be given at the time. So these sorts of things are being used to not only bring in new recruits, but to keep experienced fighters on the colonial side. You have various reasons for the difficulty in maintaining an adequate force. And it could be something that I mentioned earlier, the traditional thought of society against standing armies. You also have many of the fighters in the colonial forces are farmers. What do they have to do? They have to go home and harvest their fields, harvest their crops. Otherwise, their family may not eat, they may not have a home. So there's a lot of that going on. You have competition between each of the colonies and Congress to keep men in the militia. Remember, at this time, state governments have more power than Congress does. Each state is each colony really is its own independent country. That's why when the Revolution first starts, you've got many in the mid-Atlantic and South saying, hey, this is a war between England and New England. We don't need to be involved here. Of course, that changes. You also have issues with uncertain pay. Once the war starts, there's rampant inflation. And our monetary system really isn't set up until the Constitution occurring. So you've got all different types of currencies working their way through the colonial system. By comparison, the British are trained professionals. Since it only had about 42,000 troops, heavy recruiting programs were not needed by the British. Many of the enlisted men are farm boys, same as the United States or same as the colonies. Others were unemployed from urban slums, and still more joined to escape imprisonment. So go back 10 years, those are the types of people coming to the colonies from England. Now they're fighting for England against the colonists. The great majority become efficient soldiers because of training and discipline. Excellent training and excellent discipline. It takes a couple of years for the colonists to reach that point. So you've got all these things happening, and on paper, it looks like it should be a blowout by the British over their colonial brothers, but it doesn't quite happen that way. Officers in the British Army are drawn from the local gentry and aristocracy. They receive commissions and promotions by purchasing them. So much the way that state militias are set up, my friend is going to be nominated to be the colonel or to be the major or to be a general. In the English Army, if you've got, money talks, and you know what they say walks. So you're able to buy your commission. Though they received no formal training, they were not as reliant on book knowledge of military tactics as were many of the colonial higher-ups. Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, these guys have no military training whatsoever. Everything they learned. Alexander Hamilton becomes a great artillery officer by reading books about artillery. It's crazy. British generals, and this might be out of pride, out of an air of superiority, they lack imagination, they lack initiative, because again, they think, hey, we're the bee's knees and we're going to beat these guys into submission. Those who did show those qualities were often seen as rash and acting before they thought. Because troops were few and conscriptions unknown, the British government, following historic policy that they had followed earlier, purchased 30,000 troops from various British princes. The Hessians, of course, are the big ones that we know of, and they make up about 60% of the 30,000 that are purchased. Few acts by the king rouse as much antagonism in the colonies as using mercenaries. Massachusetts is seen by King George III and his ministers as the hotbed of disloyalty. Go back to the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act. You have the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. After the Tea Party, after word reaches London, Parliament passes the Intolerable Acts of 1774. It's a series of punitive measures against the colonies. The 1691 charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was abolished, and Massachusetts elected ruling council is replaced with a military government under General Thomas Gage. He's the commander of all British troops in North America. At his headquarters in Boston, he has about 4,000 men. That's about 4 regiments. And Parliament says that's enough to keep the colonists in line. William Legge, Legge, who's the second Earl of Dartmouth, is the Secretary of State for the colonies, and he advises Gage that, quote, the violence committed by those who have taken up arms in Massachusetts have appeared to me as acts of a rude rabble without plan, concert, or conduct, unquote. So in that quote alone, you can see that the British have no respect whatsoever for the colonists. He concludes that, quote, a small force now, if put to the test, would be able to conquer them with greater probability of success than might be expected of a larger army, unquote, which is why they think 4,000 is plenty of troops. Gage felt that no fewer than 20,000 troops would be adequate, but he worked with the hand that he was dealt. Beginning in the late summer of 1774, Gage attempts to decrease warlike preparations throughout New England by seizing stores of weapons and ammunition and all the powder, really, gunpowder. Although the colonials initially are taken by surprise, they soon mobilize. Remember, we talked about the Sons of Liberty with Sam Adams, John Hancock, and that crew from Boston. Eventually, the Sons of Liberty have chapters, if you will, in every colony. The Sons of Liberty uncover advanced details of British actions, and committees of correspondence are set up which aid in various countermeasures. Remember, committees of correspondence were set up in each state, and again, basically as a communication network to share information. Learning of a British plan to secure weapons at Fort William and Mary, an undermanned army outpost in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Boston's Committee of Correspondence sends Paul Revere on December 13th, 1774, almost a year after the Tea Party, to issue a warning to local patriots. On the 14th, several hundred men assemble colonials and they storm the fort. They capture the 6-man garrison and seize a significant quantity of powder, which is a huge deal. The act of open violence against the crown infuriates Great Britain, but their attempts to deprive the rebellion of war material over the following months were increasingly frustrated by colonial leaders, again, Adams, Hancock, whom have you. What they do is they would strip local British supply caches and they would hide the powder, ammunition, shot, and guns in private homes. On April 14th, 1775, Gage receives a letter from Dartmouth informing him that Massachusetts had been declared to be in a state of open revolt and ordering him, quote, to arrest and imprison the principal actors and abettors in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, unquote. Gage gets the orders, but the colonials are aware of what he is going to be doing. On the 16th of April, 1775, Revere rides to Concord. Concord's about 20 miles northwest of Boston, and he advises local patriots to secure military stores in advance of the British coming their way. On the 18th of April, Revere rides from Charlestown, where he confirms that the Sons of Liberty had seen 2 lanterns posted in the Old North Church, right? One if by land, 2 if by sea. And what it signaled is that the British were crossing the Charles River. He goes out to Lexington and he warns that the British are on the march. John Hancock and Sam Adams are in Lexington, and that's who the British want. They want to get a scalp here, and a very symbolic one at that. So Hancock and Adams flee to safety. Revere is then joined by William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, and they get the word out that the British are coming. As we talked about earlier, the trio were apprehended outside Lexington by a British patrol. Prescott escapes and goes on to Concord. 700 British troops leave Boston, or they spent the evening of the 18th of April, 1775, forming ranks on Boston Common with orders to seize the colonial armory at Concord. There's a lengthy public display, and what it does, it basically ensures that the British lose any chance at secrecy. So by the time the force crossed the Charles River to Cambridge, it was 2 a.m. on the 19th of April. The march to Lexington was anything but a picnic. It began in a swamp, and the British were forced to wade through disgusting brackish water that was at times up to their shoulders, up to their waists. By the time that they arrived in Lexington at 5 a.m., 77 Minutemen were assembled on the village green. Officers on both sides ordered their men to hold their positions but not to fire. It's unclear who fired the first shot, the infamous shot heard around the world, right? But it left 8 Americans dead. The colonial force basically melts, runs away, and the British move on to Concord, where they met with determined resistance from hundreds of Patriot militiamen. Outnumbered and running low on ammo, the British are forced to hightail it back to Boston. On the return march, colonial snipers took a deadly toll. At the time, it was considered ungentlemanly to stand behind a wall, a fence, a tree, be in a house, and shoot at your enemy as they're going by. Of course, the Americans are saying, hey, this is the only way that we're going to survive. So only the timely arrival of 1,100 reinforcements prevent the British from being completely routed. Casualties at Lexington and Concord. You've got roughly 275 British and less than 100 colonials. So the British are saying, okay, hey, we've got something here. This is not going to be a walk in the park. New Englanders stream into the vicinity of Boston when the news of Lexington and Concord hit. It's not really an army, but more of an armed mob. However, there are big numbers. The sheer numbers gathered on the hills outside of Boston trouble Thomas Gage. And he has 3 new subordinates who will play large roles moving forward. William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. And we'll talk about each of them moving forward. So fast forward a couple months to June 15th of 1775. The Patriots move to Breed's Hill, which is one of the hills overlooking Boston. It's a more prominent location closer to Boston on the Charlestown Peninsula, where they prepare a fortified position that all but invites the British to respond. The flag behind me is the Bunker Hill battle flag. Although the main battle takes place on Breed's Hill, it has been mistakenly called the Battle of Bunker Hill. General John Stark from New Hampshire recognizes that the left flank of the fortified colonial position is exposed along the south bank of the Mystic River. He and his men assemble a makeshift split rail barricade to blunt any flanking action by the British. When British officers look out at what had been erected overnight, they are blown away. Gage knows that he has to do something, otherwise the colonials can blow him off of the peninsula from the high ground. On the afternoon of June 17th, it's hot, it's humid, it's Boston in the summer, go figure. Gage and his commanders order British regulars and grenadiers to be transported across Boston Harbor and to disembark in Charlestown. Gage would force the U.S. or the colonials' hand with an assault. They could see, the colonials, of course, can see what's coming because the British have to come up Breed's Hill. Amongst the colonial defenders, you have numerous enslaved and freed African Americans, including Salem Poor, who we will talk about in a second. Led by General Howe, William Howe, British troops climb Breed's Hill in perfect battle formation. Allegedly, the U.S. commander, William Prescott, says to his men, "Do not fire until you see the whites of his eyes." I think that's a little Hollywood coming into play here. Historians dispute that was ever said, but it makes the story a heck of a lot better. As British troops near the fortification that the colonials have built, the colonials unleash an unbelievable volley at them and mow them down. They create a slaughter. The British retreat back to their lines. However, they reform and come back up a second time, stepping over the bodies of their peers who have been mowed down in the first wave. Same thing happens in the second wave. What also is happening is the heat and humidity are starting to take a toll on the British soldiers, well, and on the colonials as well. The British underestimate the resolve of the Patriot forces and their skill, the colonial skill, in creating a fortified position. They regroup for a third time, and the British come up the hill. Once again, Breed's Hill. This time they break through as the Patriots have run out of powder and shot. Intense hand-to-hand fighting is taking place in close quarters. Salem Poor kills Major John Pitcairn, who had risen to infamy as a result of the fighting at Lexington and Concord. Another individual that we had talked about earlier in History for Shut-ins, Joseph Warren. Dr. Joseph Warren is killed trying to rally colonial troops as they are retreating. He is shot in the head, killed instantly, and then buried in a mass grave. The the colonials eventually retreat and return to their lines outside the perimeter of Boston. The British had more than 1,000, almost 1,100 casualties, about 300 killed, 800 wounded. That's a big number. Patriot casualties were less than a third of the British losses. General Henry Clinton of the British was appalled. He calls Bunker Hill, really Breed's Hill, quote, "a dear-bought victory," unquote. What Breed's Hill does is it says to the British, you're not fighting a bunch of farmers with pitchforks. You are fighting people who have resolve, who are going to give you everything they've got. And the other thing that Breed's Hill does is it brings more recruits into the Army. Think of it. Breed's Hill takes place a full year before the Declaration of Independence. Though defeated, the British are not, the Patriots were not demoralized. Technically, it's a loss, but it's a moral victory. Those that chose to stay on and keep the British bottled up in Boston become the nucleus of the Continental Army. After June 17th, any attempts at reconciliation between the British and the colonies are done. There was something called the Olive Branch Petition that Ben Franklin, John Adams, and I believe John Jay brought to the British, brought to Howe and Clinton and said, hey, can we basically kiss and make up here? After Breed's Hill, all bets are off. So on July 3rd, 1775, Washington assumes command of U.S. forces or colonial forces. I keep saying U.S. by mistake. Colonial forces at Cambridge. Not only does he have to contain the British in Boston, but he also has to recruit an army. During the winter of 1775 and 1776, recruitment dwindles. It decreases because fresh drafts of state militias have been called up. And the militia and the Continental Army are basically drawing from the same pool of talent. The balance shifts in late winter when Henry Knox, who's a general, arrives with artillery from Fort Ticonderoga in New York. The British fort, which had occupied a strategic point between Lakes George and Champlain, had been surprised and taken over on May 10th, 1775, so a full month before Breed's Hill. Who took it over? The Green Mountain Boys, a Vermont militia group under the command of Colonel Ethan Allen. The cannons from Ticonderoga were mounted on Dorchester Heights above Boston. The guns forced General Howe, who had replaced Gage in October of 1775 because of what happened at Breed's Hill. Howe evacuates the city on St. Patrick's Day, 1776, ironically enough. Howe then goes to Halifax in Canada to prepare for an invasion of New York, and Washington moves units from Boston southward for the defense of New York. If anybody has any questions as I'm going on here, please type them in. I'm happy to answer them. Same with those who are watching the tape presentation. Any questions, type them in, and I'm happy to answer. So as forces are now looking at New York City as the next area of battle, action increases in the north. In the fall of 1775, the Colonials invade Canada. One force under General Richard Montgomery captures Montreal on November 13. Another under Benedict Arnold makes a remarkable march through Maine, through the wilderness to Quebec. Unable to take the city, Montgomery joins Arnold, many of whose troops had gone home because their enlistments ended. An attack on the city on New Year's Eve, 1775, fails. Montgomery is killed. Many of his troops are captured. The U.S. maintains a siege of Quebec, but withdrew with the arrival of British reinforcements in the spring. Pursued by the British and hit hard by smallpox, so think of what's happening now in our country. Smallpox is a major issue during the Revolutionary War. The Colonials fall back to Ticonderoga. British General I. Carleton's troops, of moving quickly down Lake Champlain, are frustrated by Arnold's construction of a fighting fleet. So again, the importance of a navy, and to call this a navy is generous, but still the importance of sea power. Forced to build one of his own, Carleton destroys most of the U.S. fleet in October of 1776, but considers it too late to attack Ticonderoga. You're getting late in the fall. Winter's about to set in, so it's going to be much more difficult. As the Colonials suffered defeat in Canada, the British did so in the South. North Carolina patriots trounce a body of loyalists at Moores Creek Bridge on February 27, 1776. Charleston, South Carolina is successfully defended against a British assault by sea in June. Charleston's going to fall at some point, but right now it's hanging tough. Having made up its mind to now crush the rebellion, the British government sends General Howe and his brother, Richard, Admiral Lord Howe, with a large fleet of 34,000 British and German troops to New York City. The British force sails on June 10, 1776, from Halifax to New York, and on July 5th, they camp on Staten Island. So the day after the Declaration of Independence is signed, you have British troops camped on Staten Island. Congress first thought that the Howes were able to negotiate peace terms, but found out, and again, this is post Breed's Hill, they find out that the Howes are only authorized to accept surrender and submission, and also to grant pardons to the traitorous rebels. As colonial and British forces were in and around Boston in the early months of 1776, both Washington and William Howe saw New York as a post of infinite importance, as they called it. John Adams described both New York City and New York State as, quote, a kind of key to the whole continent, unquote, for which, quote, no effort to secure it ought to be omitted, unquote. To Howe, capturing New York meant the ability to move Great Britain from the hostile colonial position and citizenry of Boston, thanks in part to royal governors in both New York State and New Jersey who remained active in trying to contain support for the rebellion. He could count on loyalists. Also, New York Harbor provided an ideal base of operations for the Royal Navy. New York Harbor is one of the greatest natural harbors in the world, which is why it's now one of the greatest trading ports in the world. But command of the Hudson River would ultimately cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. And of course, if they punish any colony, New England is who, or Massachusetts is who they want to go after. To try to thwart this, Washington dispatches his second in command, General Charles Lee, to prepare New York for an eventual British invasion. He wants to make any British victory costly, much like Breed's Hill, and turns New York City into an advantageous field of battle, as he called it, for the colonials. When Howe abandons Boston on St. Patrick's Day, 1776, the Continental Army joined the troops throwing up earthworks and redoubts on the heights of Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the New Jersey Palisades. Washington offers a very blunt assessment of the situation, and he says, basically, we expect a very bloody summer at New York, and I am sorry to say that we are not either in men or arms prepared for it, unquote. So Washington knows he is now in the deep end of the pool. On July 2nd, 1776, even as the Continental Congress is voting for independence in Philadelphia, Howe's Navy sails unopposed into New York Harbor, the Army and the Navy. Through July and August, the greatest British expeditionary force of the 18th century made Staten Island the second largest city in North America. So it tells you the number of troops that are camped there. On August 22nd, 1775, covered by guns of 5 men of war, you have 15,000 British and Hessian soldiers making an amphibious landing at Gravesend Bay on the southwest shore of Long Island. The plan, and actually I said 1775, it's 1776. The plan, which is conceived by General Henry Clinton, was to split the army into 3 divisions. 2 divisions would make feints directly against the colonials, while a 3rd division would, and this is the largest division, 10,000 men, under the command of Clinton, would take an unguarded pass on the left of the U.S. line and flank the colonials. When the battle starts on August 27th, the plan works to perfection. The British smash the colonials, sending mostly raw troops running for their lives. Washington is watching from Brooklyn Heights as troops are just melting away. He watches a regiment of Maryland troops sacrifice themselves in repeated charges, trying to buy time for their peers to escape. With their backs to the East River, Washington feels his troops were saved from destruction by a well-timed fog and favorable wind over the night of August 29th that covers an evacuation of all colonial troops to Manhattan. Howe fails to go after Washington, and for more than 2 weeks, the armies remain separated by the East River. During this lull, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge attend a peace conference, which takes place on September 11th at the home of a Staten Island loyalist. And this is the peace conference I mentioned before with the Olive Branch petition. I said it was John Jay, it's Edward Rutledge. However, as the British demanded that the colonists acknowledge the supremacy of Parliament, not Congress, before any negotiations would take place, it's basically a non-starter. Washington has a strategy in mind. On September 12th, a council of war decides to abandon New York City and move the main army to Harlem Heights. On the 15th of September, General Howe renews the offensive, continuing a British island-hopping campaign by landing 4,000 troops at Kip's Bay on Manhattan. Once again, colonial resistance melts. As their pursuit continues the next day, British buglers are sounding their horns as though they're in a fox chase. The colonials are offended by this. So what happens is a small colonial force is able to drive back a detachment of British light infantry at the Battle of Harlem Heights, scoring a brief but sorely needed boost of morale. The British suffer another setback on September 21st when a fire basically engulfs Manhattan, consuming nearly a quarter of the city, from Bowling Green to St. Paul's Chapel near modern-day City Hall Park. More than 1,000 structures are destroyed, including the tallest building in the city at the time, which is Trinity Church, which, if you know the geography of Manhattan, that's on the southern end of the island. Through October, the British looked to maneuver around colonial lines, landing at Throg's Neck and again at Pell's Point in Westchester County. Despite a desperate defense at White Plains, the Continental Army had been effectively expelled from New York by the end of October. A single American position remained on Manhattan Island, and that is Fort Washington. It was built directly opposite Fort Lee to stop the British from shipping up and down the Hudson River. General Nathaniel Greene, who we will talk about much more in upcoming sessions, had convinced a very skeptical George Washington that the post could be held, but determined assaults up the rocky height proved otherwise. The 2,800 casualties and prisoners of war, on the colonial side, on November 16th were a loss the Continental Army could ill afford. Washington, who is now in New Jersey, having crossed the Hudson to join Greene's command at Fort Lee, was basically crying as he sees this garrison fall. He now has to prepare the army to stop any British advance into New Jersey toward Philadelphia. Success in the coming weeks would mean basically victory or death for Washington and the Revolution. British forces under Lord Cornwallis then take Fort Lee, and on November 24th started to drive the U.S. or the colonial army, across New Jersey. Though Washington escaped to the west bank of the Delaware River, his army nearly disappears. Howe then puts his army into winter quarters with outposts at Bordentown and Trenton. We are at 5:45. I'm going to run about 5 extra minutes because I want to end on a very high note, the Battle of Trenton. That's what we're going to talk about now. So feel free to take a drink of your favorite beverage as we talk about one of the most important battles in U.S. history. So on Christmas night, Washington, of course, comes up with a plan, very bold plan. He crosses the ice-strewn Delaware River with 2,400 men and basically surprises a Hessian garrison at Trenton, even though the Hessian commander, Johann Rall, had been told that the Americans are coming. Though almost trapped by Cornwallis, who recovered Trenton on the 2nd of January, 1777, Washington makes a skillful escape during the night, wins a battle against British reinforcements at Princeton on the 3rd of January, and goes into winter quarters around Morristown, which is a very defensible position. The Trenton-Princeton campaign rouses the country. Enlistments improve, and it saves the revolution from collapse. On the 23rd of December, 1776, Thomas Paine writes the first American crisis paper. Great read. Starts with, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls," unquote. Washington's army is falling apart before his eyes because of the various defeats that we've talked about around New York City, and many of his men's enlistments are going to expire at the end of the year. The only thing saving his army right now is the winter. British are in winter quarters, and the Delaware River. The British retire to their winter quarters in hopes that either winter or renewed hostilities in the spring will end the rebellion. After asking his men to stay for one last effort, Washington devises a daring plan to stun the British, capture supplies, and improve colonial morale. The plan is to ferry his army across the Delaware on Christmas night, strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton. Initially devised as a three-pronged attack, a nor'easter and the ice-choked river turned back two of Washington's columns. Only the main army, with Washington at its head, made the crossing 9 miles to the north of Trenton. Behind schedule because of the storm, the Colonials arrive on the outskirts of Trenton around daybreak on the 26th of December. Washington splits his force in two columns. One, commanded by our good friend Nathaniel Greene, attacks from the north, while a second under John Sullivan attacks from the west to cut the line of retreat to the south. The Hessian garrison, under the command of Colonel Rall, had been harassed by colonial militia for weeks. Despite Washington engaging the pickets on the edge of town, Rall is taken completely by surprise. For 2 hours, the Battle of Trenton goes on. Hessians pull back in as orderly a fashion as possible through the streets of Trenton, only to be surrounded by the Colonials in a peach orchard on the outskirts of Trenton. The Hessian commander attempts to rally his men, but it's useless. They were demoralized, they're frightened, they're ready to give up. A U.S. soldier, a colonial soldier, shoots Rall mortally, wounding him. The remaining Hessians throw down their weapons and plead for mercy. In total, the Hessians lose 22 who were killed in action, with another 86 casualties. The important piece, there are 900 Hessian prisoners of war. It's gigantic. The U.S., or the Colonials, seize much-needed supplies, including additional cannons and 1,200 muskets. In total, the Colonials have 5 wounded casualties. Among them is an 18-year-old by the name of James Monroe, future president. He suffers a severe shoulder wound. It's a stunning victory that provides a vital boost to the colonial cause when it was most desperately needed. We will stop there today. Thank you to those who have joined and to those who are watching the tape presentation. We will be back tomorrow, and we will pick up with the Battle of Princeton and move forward. Tomorrow, we will also be going at 5 p.m. This seems to work well. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. Have a great evening. Take care.